This is the first poll conducted entirely since the general election was announced. And what we found was that the Labour Party enjoys a lead of 17 points over the Conservatives. Labour on 44%, the Conservatives on 27%, and then Reform further back on 10%. And that is, it goes without saying, that means the Conservatives start this election campaign at a significant deficit to Labour. They are behind. There is a big gap to close.
Yeah, I mean, other polling organisations have different numbers because they have different methodologies. But according to your model, your way of doing things, that is a striking number. You've never seen a deficit like this on day one of a campaign. I mean, there's so many numbers in here which really catch your eye, aren't there? The mood of time for a change. You've actually had a good stab at measuring it.
Well, absolutely. So in that same poll, we asked people, is it time for a change or should we stick with the plan? We tested that Conservative line about sticking with the plan. And what came back was 70% of the public said it was time for change. 30% said we should stick with the plan. And we then asked about the two leaders. Do they represent change or do they represent status quo? And perhaps unsurprisingly, 81% said that Rishi Sunak represented the status quo. But what was interesting, and this is a change since January, was 51% said Keir Starmer represented change, 49% said he didn't. So it's quite narrow. But when we asked in January, it was the other way round. 59% said that Keir Starmer would be more of the same. Only 41% said change. So what's happened is since January, Keir Starmer has moved ahead on that change metric. And I think the Labour Party will be quite pleased with that. It's been in all of their branding that we've seen over the course of the past few days, that word change, really trying to tap into it.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about these polls here in this studio with you week after a week, and we look at all the polls as they come in. And when we try and project those polls into where we're going with this general election, again and again you hear this presumption, yeah, but it's bound to narrow. The polls are bound to narrow when you get closer to the election. I hear that so many times. It just isn't happening, though.
It certainly hasn't happened yet. I would still not be surprised if we see a bit of narrowing. Some of those people who voted Conservative in 2019 now say they don't know. I think some will still go back. But we're talking historically unprecedented levels of people having to switch back to get there. And the other thing, and this jumped out at me from the poll we just got back, was there has been some movement. And the interesting movement is Keir Starmer and the Labour Party tipping into positive approval for the first time since we've been measuring this year. So it's only narrows, +2, +3, but they're actually in positive approval territory in this poll compared to others. Before it's been Keir Starmer's going to enter office quite unpopular, certainly below David Cameron, Tony Blair. This, I think, would be quite an encouraging sign for him.
What does that mean? Because we've already got numbers, your numbers especially, which tell us that Labour's got a pretty commanding lead. Now you tell us they're only narrowly in approval terms. Just explain that.
So one of the questions that we ask, as well as asking who would you vote for, we ask if the party leaders are doing a good job or a bad job, and we ask the same question about the parties. And then what we do is we take the numbers saying good job and the numbers saying bad job and take them off one another to get a net score. We call it an approval score. Yeah. And what we find in our polling is Keir Starmer just in the black, +2 there, which doesn't sound like much, but he's been way underwater. Rishi Sunak, unfortunately, down at -27 points in that. So a big gap on the leaders and a big gap on the parties.
So it's a verdict on Keir Starmer himself. So when we say, look, is Keir Starmer, is Labour ahead purely because they're not the Conservatives? Well, that's obviously true for a great many people. But those who are willing to say and believe that maybe they are ahead or they support Labour, because of Keir Starmer, that number is going up.
That number is going up. That approval rate is going up. There's no doubt, as you say, for most people, this
not
is a
huge,
verdict
though,
on...
Not a huge.
It's not huge. This isn't Blair 1997.
What sort of numbers would he have got
about that. I mean, he was, I don't have them to hand, but he was certainly much higher. It was +20, 30, actually, I think, by the time he got into office. But to start off at this base, it's quite low, but it's not negative. And I think that, again, the Labour Party will look at that. I should say, Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives have improved slightly in this poll as well compared to others, but they're still way back in the minus minus
Right.
20s.
Now, you've been doing some sampling on the question of particular issues and where the parties stand on that. That's always worth a look. What can you say?
Well, this is actually some polling from JL Partners, and what they have been looking at is where do the parties stand on various issues in terms of who does the public think is best placed to handle them, but also, interestingly, how does that compare with how salient those issues are? So
Yes.
how important they're going to be to people in deciding their vote. And Labour leads on the three most important issues for voters. In fact, they've got a lead of over 10 points on all of them. The NHS, cost of living, and growing the economy. You've got Labour ahead. Now, there is one bright spot for the Conservatives, and it's one that you might expect, is that they lead on tackling illegal immigration. That's issue number 4 for the voters. It's one of only a handful
Yes.
where the Conservatives are ahead, which is also reducing migration, Ukraine, tackling woke is another one. But all of those other issues, you see the Labour Party further ahead. So, and this really goes to the challenge the Conservatives face, right? They're both behind in the voting attention, they're behind on the big issues that people care about, and they're far behind on the leader approval ratings. And they need all of those to turn around to have a chance at changing the course of the election.
Interesting on these subjects of the economy, NHS, cost of living, because one imagines that most people are not immersed in the detail of what the parties are offering. We haven't had the manifestos, but even we've had a good deal of discussion and debate. And I imagine most people getting on with their lives don't listen closely to what the particular policy perspectives of the parties is, or its state of evolution. And yet you have this 10-point advantage for Labour, which I guess is mostly then a kind of an impressionistic judgment.
It is an impressionistic judgment. I guess what's probably more interesting is the fact you generally tend to find Labour leading on the NHS. You generally tend to find the Conservatives leading on illegal immigration. And the economy is more the one which tends to change. I mean, it's worth saying, even in 1997, the Conservatives were leading in some polls on the question of who would manage the economy better. So to have lost that, I think, is quite significant. The other thing to say is we also asked, this time last week, we were talking about Keir Starmer's pledges. And over the weekend, we had an opportunity to ask people about them. And what was really interesting was, a lot of the conversation in Westminster was like, gosh, these aren't very ambitious, are they? They don't add much. Actually, when we asked the public about them, they were more likely to say that the 6 pledges were too ambitious rather than not ambitious enough, which I think gets to the heart of that kind of public cynicism. Can anyone coming into office after the election actually deliver and turn things around?
Now, we talked a lot yesterday about what the Conservative Party, Tory MPs and ministers thought about the announcement, which took us all pretty much by surprise. What about the public? What did they think about the decision to call that election for that time yesterday?
Well, I mean, I guess there's good news for the Conservatives in the 6 in 10. This was a YouGov poll, said it was the right decision to call the election, but perhaps not for the reasons the Conservatives might have wanted.
Certain impatience.
Indeed. And we've really found that in our focus groups. The thought of an election campaign going on all over the summer, not having that opportunity to choose. In fact, we had a focus group last night and someone was like, this is great. We've had all these prime ministers and we haven't been able to choose. Now we get to choose, which I thought was quite funny. But YouGov also asked, how likely do you think it is? Rishi Sunak has called this election. How likely do you think it is the Conservatives hang on? And 75% said they thought it was unlikely the Conservatives would win the election. And one of the things that we know in polling world is that actually that wisdom of the crowds, asking the public not who they'll vote for, but who they think will win, can often actually be more accurate than voting intention itself. So another data point there to concern the Conservatives.
Just a word about reform, and we have the news today that Nigel Farage, who is not running now, confirmed he's not standing as a candidate for Parliament for the Reform Party, which looks like a bit of a setback for reform. I know there's been polling which suggests that would have been a really significant advantage for reform. What do you make of where we are?
Yeah, I think that is a blow to reform, and the Conservatives, it's one area where they will be breathing a sigh of relief. I slightly think that reform, seeming to have peaked and ticking down in some polls, factored into that election decision, the timing decision to have it now rather than wait until the summer when boats become more salient. And in fact, if you look at our poll now with Reform on 10%, that's the lowest that they have been for some time in the polls. It does seem they lost momentum after the local elections. And without Nigel Farage there as a candidate to give them that extra boost, I would not be surprised if we're talking in this slot in a couple of weeks where they've been squeezed even more.
Interesting. Yeah.